What's up, everybody? Hopefully, you guys are doing good as always. Today, we have another opening chess guide video. We're looking at the English defense, which is characterized with b6, bishop to b7, and e6. Um, and although the setup itself looks very passive, it prepares a lot of moves that are incredibly aggressive, and it's a great way to combat a lot of the annoying moves in the center, such as d4, c4, and even e4. Because notice that these three pieces here, these three moves that you make in the start, none of them really immediately fight for the center very heavily, and therefore a lot of times your opponent as white will play d4, c4, and e4, or at least a combination of them. So let's go ahead and take a look at what this might look like. Let's say d4, you can play b6, c4, e6, e4, and now bishop to b7. So again, a combination of these moves. And although this might look very scary, notice that these two pawns here actually prepare some very powerful pushes such as f5, d5, and c5, which all will fight for the center and all can be very powerful. So let's go ahead and take a look at how this might continue. Of course, you're attacking the pawn here, so knight to c3 seems like a very natural move. You can play bishop to b4, both of your bishops finding very beautiful squares to be in the game. And now there's already room for your opponent to make a couple of mistakes. For example, bishop to d3 runs into f5. And f5, like I mentioned, it's a great way to fight for the center. And f5 is one of the more common moves that you're going to play in this opening to really go ahead and try to gain the center. So of course the bishop developing very fast leaves this pawn undefended, and therefore this pawn is pinned. It cannot move because otherwise, as I'll show you, the bishop takes the pawn and then also the rook afterwards. And therefore f5 is already quite annoying, which is why often you might actually see f3 in positions such as these, trying to just stop this bishop from having much control. But this does not actually stop f5, because after f5, after takes, you have this beautiful knight to h6 idea, and it looks very crazy. But the point is, you're giving away some material, some pawns specifically, in order to get a huge boost in development and a pretty deadly attack. So let's go ahead and see how this continues. Let's say pawn takes, and we'll look at what happens if bishop takes in just one moment. But let's say pawn takes. You don't take back. Instead, you play knight to f5, which is the whole idea of moving the knight from h6. You want it to be on f5, where with the queen and some other pieces, it can form a pretty deadly attack. So let's actually see this attack go into play. Let's say pawn takes, knight takes, and now let's say a3. Seems like a very normal move here. Well, it's actually a very big mistake, because after takes, and queen to h4, already your knight here, this bishop, and this queen are all attacking together. And after g3, notice that now you can actually go ahead and take. And of course, after take, the rook is hit here. And this is a pretty bad position to be able to play. Instead, let's suppose that they play a bit of a better move here, such as bishop to f4, because it's defending the pawn here, and therefore the knight won't be able to take. You still play queen to a4, queen to h4 actually. But then after g3, notice that g3 comes with another weakness, which is this bishop coming here and attacking this pawn. So now you can actually go into this position here, and in the end, a lot of times you're going to be able to take this pawn here and just have an even more deadly position. And from here, of course, the rook is hit, the rook has to move, and you can very easily castle. Let's suppose the king move, because notice that right now you're actually threatening to get the other rook here, start pinning the pieces, and really adding more pressure. So king to f2 seems very reasonable. Although usually you're going to want to castle, castling seems a bit questionable here, and king to f2, it seems like it's just trying to, control any attacks that might happen. But you can actually continue by taking, and if bishop takes, then knight takes. So instead, if knight takes, you actually have rook to e8. Let's say b3, you're preparing this beautiful g5 idea, followed by knight takes d4 check, and of course, this is just completely winning. So understand that this is one very specific line, but what I'm showing you here is very common ideas that you can implement into many other lines. So if we kind of recap this, because again, it was a pretty specific line, a lot of times you're gonna, even against f3, you're gonna end up playing pawn to f5, and after this trade or after this take, you don't trade. Instead, knight to h6, you get your knight onto f5, and then you can get your queen out quite early on, and eventually you can trade the queens. Don't be scared to do so, and you castle kingside to get your rook into the game, which also allows the other rook to come to e8. And just, I mean, this is such a powerful position. And you're giving away a lot of pawns early on, but this is a beautiful opening to recognize that gambiting pawns is not a bad thing, as here you obviously have a huge advantage in a beautiful attack with all of your minor pieces and major pieces coming in to play. Let's go ahead and take a look at some other options that might happen, because here, notice that the bishop can take, and this seems like this just ruins your whole plan, right? Well, it doesn't actually, because you have this beautiful queen to h4 check, because if you take with the pawn, then all of a sudden castling here seems very questionable. All of a sudden, you have this very broken up structure with which your opponent can try to attack, and it just doesn't seem very pleasant for you. So instead, queen to h4 check, intermediate move, and after takes, the queen can come to e3, and even without this knight coming to f5, you still have the ability to attack. As I'll show you some more lines, you can take, the queen can take, the king moves, and now you can castle. And again, you get this idea where you castle, you get your rook into play, and with the help of a bishop, a queen, and in the future also possibly the other rook, you just have a deadly attack that's already kind of brewing up. Already notice all of this power coming here on this pawn. It's just incredibly hard for white to continue to be accurate when you're adding all of this pressure, and that's a big thing. And this is how this opening is so aggressive. You know, the first three moves here, as I'll show, they seem incredibly passive. They seem like you're just giving white control. But with the ability to play f5, and as I'll show you soon, also c5 in some lines, you actually really combat these pawns, and you're actually going to be the one who's very aggressive, and you're going to be the better player for many of the lines here. Now, this was kind of going over what happens if they play all of these pawns here. But a lot of times, players who end up playing d4, they don't actually play e4. Instead, they only play c4, because as a d4 player, often you're prepared to play c4, but you know, you very rarely go into this line where you also have e4. So therefore, it might seem, you know, less comfortable for them to play it, which is why you also need to know how to play against these two pawns. So let's go ahead and take a look exactly how to do that. So if they're not going to play e4, they're most likely looking for playing knight to c3. You're going to play bishop to b7. This is just a move that you're going to play almost just by default in this opening here. And now they're most likely going to play a move like bishop to f4, just, you know, making a target. Maybe the knight can help with attacking this target later on. And of course, just developing the bishop before you close off the dark squares here, and the bishop will be trapped for a long time. And how do you approach this position? Because notice there's a key difference with the pawn missing on e4, which is now you can actually play knight to f6, because, you know, previously you wanted this knight not to come to f6 for a number of reasons. First off, if the pawn's here, f5 is very powerful to just fight the pawn here. Also, again, the knight can come to h6 like I showed and then go to f5 by itself. But with the pawn not here, knight to f6 is much more common and much more reasonable, because the pawn, first off, cannot go to e5 and just hit the knight by default, right? If the knight was on e4 and then you played knight to f6, they could just go for e5, and maybe that could be a bit uncomfortable. But also, f5 is less necessary here, because there's no real threat that they're going to play e4 in the future, and you don't really need f5 to kind of stop this, you know, pawn here. And overall, your knight coming to f6 is much more reasonable. So that's the big difference between whether they have all three pawns or whether they only have two. You don't play f5, and you can instead play knight to f6. And we'll look at what you do instead of playing f5 later on, because later on, instead of playing f5, you still need to fight for the center somewhere, or somehow rather, so you're going to go ahead and play c5, and again, we'll look at that in just a moment. So you can go knight to f5. You could also start with bishop b4. Here they can go for e3. You can go knight to f6 here, but that does allow knight to e2, and then if you take, they can take back with this other knight. So maybe, you know, a better option would be taking the knight here. They have to take back, and then knight to f6. It really depends if you want to play against this kind of broken structure here, because of course this does also come with some advantages for white, being, you know, this file they can maybe try to attack on, and some other benefits. You know, this is more open for them to develop and things like that. So it really, from this position, depends on how you want to play the game. Do you want them to have this structure? Maybe you don't. But for the most part, all of your pieces come very normally, very naturally. You can castle in this position. And like I showed, very often you're going to play this beautiful c5 push here. A very important and critical move to play, because for the most part, you're just really combating this whole pressure here in the center, this whole position that they have here. And this is just going to be very dangerous for them. So for example, let's look at what happens. If they take, you can actually take with the bishop, and all of a sudden this is looking much better for you. So for example, let's say we have a3, you can even develop your knight to c6. You can also obviously play some other moves, but as you notice, already their central control is starting to break down a little bit. You have a lot of development, a lot of potential to attack and add pressure on the king. Your knights can come as well, and of course this whole file here is much more open, which is something that you can try to use to your advantage as well. So this whole c5 move, oh, it accidentally skipped a little bit here, so let's go ahead and go back into that line. But as I was saying, the whole c5 move is a very important move that you want to play, because otherwise, unfortunately, white just has a ton of pressure in the center, and even with your extra development that you have here, it's just not enough compensation. You need to look to play c5 to really give you a very strong edge. So this whole, so far this video has really showed you, what to do against all three pawns, and f5 is a common idea, or what to do against just d4 and c4, and then, of course, c5 is a common idea. But now I'm going to go ahead and actually show you a game where Hikaru Nakamura played with the black pieces, and he introduces some new ideas, so let's go ahead and take a look. So Hikaru has the black pieces. We see d4, b6, we see e4, bishop to b7, bishop to d3, and now e6. So it's a different position from what we saw earlier, because rather than having the pawns on c4 and d4, or all of the pawns, we just have pawns on e4 and d4. So this game here will show you how Hikaru Nakamura decided to deal with the only two central pawns being pushed and no c pawn to kind of combine in the center. So here, knight to f3, and now already instantly d5, not letting these pawns in the center have much control. And so d5, like I mentioned in the other part of this video, is not something that you typically are going to do when there's other pawns here. If there's other pawns, a lot of times f5 is more common. A lot of times c5 is much more common. In fact, even in this position, c5 is a completely fine move to play. Instead, he goes for d5, which is why you need to be open to be flexible, right? There are some positions where you're going to want to play d5. There are some positions where you're going to want to play c5 or f5. The big thing is every position calls for a different pawn break, and so you want to be flexible. You want to really look at all of your options and see which one you think is the most appealing. So here, queen comes to e2. Knight to f6. Notice he's not too scared of e5. I think e5 is pretty powerful here, but Hikaru is just not too worried about this. In a case like this, he can obviously move the knight back to d7, and it doesn't seem too troubling here. So instead, what happens? Well, we see knight coming to d2, and now c5. So sometimes you're going to actually want to combine multiple of these moves, right? f5, d5, and c5 are the three moves that I talked about, and sometimes you're actually going to want to combine them, as we see here. We have takes, we have bishop takes developing, knight coming to c6, and queen coming to c7. And now we have b4 by Hikaru's opponent, grabbing space in the queen side. And here is a very critical position, because Hikaru brought the bishop back, but there's chances to play knight to c4. And if takes, you can take with the bishop. And the reason that this is much better is, first off, of course, you're already putting some pressure, but also notice that this bishop here has a lot of potential to attack, but there's some pieces in the way, such as these knights. So by playing this variation where you move the knight to d4, you trade the knights, it's already looking much more open. And of course, after this possible trade, because these pawns can easily trade themselves at some point in the game, after this, these queens and bishops can all come to life and really be very powerful. And this is kind of the position that I want to stop you at, because Hikaru actually went on to lose this game. But the point is, in this position right here alone, black is better. And so the point of this game wasn't necessarily to show you that you're going to win every game that you play, but rather to show you that going into the middle game, which we're definitely in right now, going into the middle game, you can have an incredibly good position by playing the English opening. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Hopefully it gave you some ability to actually go ahead and try it. You probably know enough information now to go ahead and play this right now immediately. I encourage you to let me know how this opening goes for you. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you guys subscribe, leave a like, and comment down below for future suggestions that you want to see. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.